Continuation bets are shows of strength when the last acting preflop player makes a bet postflop. Lots of players have considered the idea, but the hidden value of the continuation bet in tournament poker is in the sizing.
The idea is simple enough. Continued aggression across rounds of betting induces folding, making for a potentially profitable bluff. Continuation bets, or C-bets, are fairly commonplace in most poker games these days, but the amount you risk can drastically change the average profit of your continuation bet bluff. Small edges in poker add up over time, so let's use this handy risk and reward formula to determine how often your bet needs to work in order to profit. When you raise preflop and c-bet 275, the size of the pot, you can be rewarded 275 chips if your opponent folds. The risk and reward formula shows that you only need to win 50% of the time to profit. Easy enough, so back to the table. So far you don't even know what hand you've chosen to raise preflop. But before you consider your hand, let's first consider the button caller. Let's give him a perhaps simplified preflop calling range of pocket 5s through pocket 9s and ace-jack suited. In practice, depending on the player, position, stack sizes, and your reads, the range should change. With some quick hand combination analysis, also known as counting, you can see that there are 31 combinations estimated to be in your opponent's calling range. Let's assume that your opponent is worried about a possible pair of kings on the flop, which is not an unreasonable assumption given your open raising position, and that he folds all of his hands he called with preflop except pocket 8s and pocket 9s when he faces your flop bet. If that's true, then your opponent actually folds 21% more often to your pot size bet than you need him to fold to in order to profit. So, how can you improve your game plan with that information in mind? Since you don't need to risk as much, you decide to go with a smaller bet of 175. Can you risk less and still profit? Let's get a little more practice with our risk and reward formula to find out. Now with your smaller bet, you need your opponent to defend against your bet 38.9% of the time in order to bluff profitably. In other words, your opponent has to fold 61.1% of the time for you to profit. Because you believe your opponent folds 71% of the time, that 175 chips is even closer to the minimal amount that you need to risk in order to profit, so you're heading in the right direction. Ideally, though, you can combine the benefits of minimizing your risk for bluffing with a smaller continuation bet size with having your opponent fold his static distribution. A static distribution is a group of hands open to attack by bet size because your opponent has little or no change in reaction to a large range of bet sizes. If you bet a little, or if you bet a lot, your opponent plans to fold just as often. A lot of the time, the board texture induces even great players into folding far too often, as we have just noticed with your opponent who folds 71% of the time on this board. In other words, the board texture allows for a potentially exploitable play. You get the best of this exploitation by finding the smallest bet size, the lowest risk bluff for you, that achieves that high folding frequency. So if your assumptions about your opponent's folding frequency hold for the minimum amount to risk, how much should you bet to risk the least amount while also bluffing profitably? Well, you already know the folding frequency from combination counting and your pre- and post-flop assumptions. You know the reward is 275, the number of chips in the pot. So now all you need to determine is the risk, the minimum size of your continuation bet in order to profit. Let's revisit our risk and reward formula along with a little algebra. Since we are solving for risk, let's allow risk to equal x. Now you can plug in the numbers you know and solve for x, the minimum profitable amount to risk. After the algebra has been completed, you have solved for x, the minimum amount to risk that is necessary to profit with your continuation bet bluff against this player on this board. Such a precise size like 112.32 is not realistic in live action poker setting, and the math can be difficult or time consuming to do while you're playing, but that's not the point of this exercise. So here are quick tips for a successful continuation bet bluff. You just learned tip 1, how to manage your bluff sizing. Set assumptions and then use the risk and reward formula to solve for the best bet size for a bluff. The point is not only to understand exactly how sizing affects risk. So don't worry about betting to the correct 1/100th of a bet each time you want to bluff. Instead, practice different scenarios with different distributions and different boards so that you can get a better feeling for what hands might fold and what sizes play best in each spot. PokerSprout.com goes into more detail about how to make a more comprehensive plan and more complete video series. The next tip is the more assumptions that you make about your opponent, even fairly accurate assumptions, the more likely your margin of error is to affect your bet sizing calculation. Again, solving for the perfect size has little meaning because of the variance. What matters is that you now have a feel for how betting smaller, and often how much smaller, affects the amount that you should risk on a bluff. Good players might assume that you're bluffing one size and value betting with another, then adjust. If you bet small, then they may always call or bluff raise to try to foil your plan. So make sure you know your competition before you go for the small bluff bet, or choose a healthy mix of value betting hands to complement those bluffs.
You know how to solve for the minimal amount of risk on a continuation bet bluff. Also, you know how to keep in mind board texture, the variance of your assumptions, and the risk and rewards of your bets. Now go and find some profitable continuation bet bluff spots.